We've been talking about this idea that when God says go, rebellion says no. And that's really the theme of the story of Jonah. So would you guys say that with me on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. When God says go, rebellion says no. And that really is the story of Jonah, a man who was close to God, but said no to God in a particular moment. And that led to storms and calamity in his life. And you and I know this, that if you've been a follower of Jesus for any period of time, or maybe you struggle to believe in this faith and you kind of wonder about God or wonder about Jesus, we're all in the same boat. Dad joke, boat, Jonah, boat, all that kind of stuff. Great. Happy Father's Day, everybody. We're all in the same boat when it comes to this tension of dealing with the reality that sometimes God asks us to do things that do not make sense. And when he does that, we've got three responses. The first one is what Jonah does in chapter 1 and kind of deals with the consequences of that in chapter 2. It's rebellious running. He heads the opposite direction we find in Jonah chapter 1. God says to do one thing and he says, no, I'm not doing that. And he tries to get out of Dodge. The second one is resentful obedience. That's what we're going to see today in Jonah chapter 3. It's kind of this moment where Jonah finally says, okay, I'll go do what you've asked me to do, but I'm not going to be happy about it. I'm going to be irritated by it, and I'm going to do it really out of, not out of a place of joy, but really out of a place of resentment. And then we get to the third one. This is really the goal. This is what I believe, like if we live this way, if this is the default of our life, if this is the operating system for our day-to-day, we'll change the way we experience God. We'll lead to more joy in our life, more happiness, and less anxiety and stress, is when you and I choose, when God asks us to do something that we don't want to do or that doesn't make sense to us, to simply trust. Redemptive trust is this notion or idea that says, God, I don't know why this is the best decision. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I've seen what you've done in the past, and I know that you are good, and I trust that even if I cannot see how this is working out for me, that it is what is best. And what's so cool about Jonah is that Jonah is not a story that ends with him becoming this guy of redemptive trust. And the reason why I say that that's cool is because that's the tension that you and I feel every day. That for many of us, if we're honest, there are just places in our life, there are certain portions of our life that we still kind of operate in a place of resentful obedience. Like some of us, we're at church today kind of out of resentful obedience. We think we're supposed to be here, so we're here. For some of us, we serve, and it's out of resentful obedience because we think we're supposed to do it, but we really don't find joy in doing it. For some of us, it's about generosity. We give, but we're not really happy when we give, but we do it because we think we're supposed to do it. And God's invitation to every single one of us is to move from resentful obedience to redemptive trust, to find great joy in all of the things that he has commanded us to do, even the ones that do not make sense to us. And what's so cool about this story is that Jonah is a not-so-feel-good, too close-to-home story of our rebellion and our resentful obedience. And at the same time, despite that rebellion, despite that resentful obedience that Jonah shows, God's loving pursuit. That despite what we do, God is greater than our actions. That God is able to work in the midst of us trying to work out what it means to trust him in our daily lives. And that journey is a day by day, step by step, moment by moment reality. So we get to Jonah chapter 3, verse 1, and to catch you up to this point in the story, Jonah has ran away from what God has asked him to do. He's gotten on a boat. He's headed to the southern coast of Spain. As he's heading that way, a great storm comes up. He gets thrown off of the boat. The sailors throw him off because that's the consequence of his actions. He gets swallowed by a big fish. He spends 3 days and 3 nights in this fish. He has this kind of aha moment where he finally turns to God and he acknowledges that he's the one who's the problem, that it's not God's fault that he's in this situation, but it's a prison that he's made for himself. And then eventually this fish sends Jonah out and he gets back onto dry land, and that's where the story picks up. And here's what we're going to find today, is that there's one reality about faith that you and I need to understand, and then there's 3 truths about God that I think if we were to wrestle with would really open our hearts up to understanding who he is. So the first 2 weeks have all been about Jonah and his rebellion, and this week is about God and his pursuit of us. How does God pursue us? So this is how the story picks up. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. So the same thing that God said in Jonah chapter 1, he says in Jonah chapter 3. And he says, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. These are the exact words that are used in the first chapter. Jonah goes through all of this stuff. He gets on land. And the first thing that God says to him is, hey, buddy, you got to go to Nineveh still. Here's the reality that I want us to see today. It's a tough one, all right? It's that God will take you right back to the place you said no. I remember my dad used to say this all the time growing up, and it used to frustrate me. He said, God's not going to move you on from the lesson you're on until you've learned the lesson that you need to learn. And I was like, I don't like that because I play video games. Give me the cheat codes. Like, that's what I'm looking for. I want to know what the easiest, most efficient, simplest way to get to where I want to get to, I can get there, and I want to be able to do it as fast as possible with as little pain as possible, right? That's the way in which many of us think about life. But here's the reality. And some of you are feeling this way right now. I mean, it's been 10 years, it's been 20 years, it's been 30 years, and you find yourself beating your head up against the same brick wall, and it's because you have yet to surrender the thing that God has invited you to surrender. This is Jonah's moment. Jonah, I'm not moving you away from what I originally called you to do. You still got to go to Nineveh. And here's the reality, and here's the reason why. Walking in the way of Jesus, it just doesn't come with shortcuts. There's no quick way to get to who God is calling you to be. Like, you can't speed up your spiritual formation and you're becoming like Jesus. It's a day-by-day, moment-by-moment reality. But we love our shortcuts, don't we? Gosh, we love them. I took my daughter, Elise, to Starbucks a couple of weeks ago. And we do this thing where if we get, about 45 minutes to an hour where we've got some time, we'll go out to Starbucks, we'll grab, a hot chocolate and a cake pop, and I'll get coffee, and we'll sit down, and our Starbucks has a bunch of games that are there that you can pick up, and we'll play a board game. And so we picked up the Game of Life. Anybody know the Game of Life? We picked it up, and we decided to start playing it. And it's just so much fun playing with my kids and kind of seeing their life, come to fruition. So we start playing the Game of Life, and we get to this moment in the Game of Life, and maybe you've played it before, where there's two options. You can take the college route or you can take the career route, right? And the college route, it takes longer. There's more steps in the college route than there is the career route. So we get to this point in the game, and I look at Elise, and I say, Elise, what are you going to do? And she's like, which one gets me to the end the fastest? And I said, the career route. And she's like, I'm going that way. And I was like, but the college route, like usually in this game, like you end up with more money. Like you get higher paying jobs. And that's when you know it's a game, right? Because usually when you graduate college, you end up with no job and more debt, right? Like that's the way it works. And so she's like, I want to go the fast way. So she gets her little car. She goes the career route. She gets a job. She's a teacher. The amount that she's getting paid as a teacher is way more than actually teachers get paid. And I'm like, this is definitely a game. And she goes that route. I go the college route, and I decide this will be a day of fun and lessons. And so I kind of go the college route. I get my job. And this girl, her job is to stop at nothing. Like she's spinning the deal. When I'm not looking, she's spinning it again to get a higher number. Like she's skipping pieces. She's just like, I'm going to win. I'm going to get there first. And so she's flying. Like she has opportunities to stop and buy property. She doesn't buy property. The only thing she stops for is pets. By the time this game is over, the girl's got 2 cars. It's her and like 11 pets. And I'm like, this might be your future. Like, I don't know. And so she gets to the end of the game. She's first. She wins. She's got all this cash, and she's just excited, right? And so I'm kind of slowly meandering around, doing my deal. And she's like, hurry up, Dad. We get to the end. We count our money, and she's got more stacks. Like her money looks higher because it's like 5s and 10s, and Dad's over here with some cool 100s, you know what I'm saying? And as the game goes, she like gets about $400,000 maybe, and I've got about like $2 million. I'm like paying my properties, all that kind of stuff. And she thinks that she's won. She's like, Dad, I won. I was like, honey, count your money. She's like, all right, I got 400. I was like, great. She's like, what do you have? I was like, 2 million. Read them and weep, right? Because I'm building resilient kids, and I don't let them win at anything. And so we get to the end of the game, and it's very clear that I've won. I'm going to confess them to you. I pulled out my phone, hit record, put that thing in front of her face, and I said, what did we learn today? And she said, go to college and invest in real estate. But here's the thing about life. Is that for you and I, we're looking for the shortcut. And so often the shortcut is my way instead of God's way. So I look for the shortcut in my marriage instead of doing it God's way. I look for the shortcut in my singleness instead of doing it God's way. I look for the shortcut in my finances instead of doing it God's way. I look for the shortcut in my way that I think about my occupation and work instead of doing it God's way. And at the end of the day, you need to know this, is that shortcuts are really delays that eventually lead to dead ends. And that's what Jonah experiences. And that's the reality of life. God will bring you back to the same place over and over and over again until you surrender to him. So here's a question I want you to maybe ponder as we're processing the message today. And maybe this is all you need for today. Are you stuck because you're avoiding your next step in following Jesus? Jesus has called you to take a step of obedience in your marriage or in your finances or in your relationships, and you are unwilling to do it. Well, friend, you will not move forward in your walk with God until you say yes. Jonah says yes. In verse 3, we find this. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord, and he went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now stop here. This is a big deal. I don't want to minimize the gravity of what Jonah is willing to do here. Jonah knows that the people of Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire, these are a historically known, documented, one of the most violent, ruthless peoples that have ever lived. One of the most ruthless empires of all time. They hated Israel and routinely sacked the people of God, the people that Jonah loved. And so Jonah stepping into this space, in many ways, is a death sentence for him. It would be tantamount to a Jewish rabbi walking through the streets of Berlin in Nazi Germany, saying, hey, you need to follow God. That would be the kind of reality. I mean, this is a death sentence on his life. This is not an easy choice to walk into Nineveh. And yet he does. And he walks into this great city, and he says, 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now, this is important to notice here, is that the message that Jonah gives is not a message inviting people to experience the love of God or the grace of God or the kindness of God. It's a pretty wrathful, angry message. In fact, scholars tell us that this is a message that most likely Jonah, knowing he would die, was happy to give. All right? So I don't want us to think of Jonah as this guy whose life is fully changed. He's fully given himself to the compassion and the love of God. No, he's walking into the city saying, y'all gonna burn. Like, that's what he's saying. And he's kind of happy to do it. So the expectation, if you're an audience listening to this story in the ancient Near East, you're a kid huddled around the fire listening to your grandpa tell it, or maybe you've got these documents and you're able to read them, your expectation is that the story ends with Jonah giving his life. Maybe he's a martyr for God, but that's not what happens. Instead, something incredibly miraculous occurs. We find this in verse 5, that the Ninevites, these people who were categorically opposed to the people of Israel, believed God. Now, I want to stop here because I think there's something really, really important to catch. The word for God here is not the word Yahweh. It's the word Elohim. And so the word Yahweh is the personal God that is in reference to the idea of the Jewish people, the people of God, believing in God personally, them turning their hearts and giving themselves completely and wholly to God. That is not what the people of Nineveh did. In fact, it would be erroneous for us to say that the entire city of Nineveh became followers of the way of Jesus or became followers of God. That is not what happened. They believed, the writer uses the word Elohim, meaning they believed that this God existed, but that did not mean that this was the only God that they believed in. See, the way of the Assyrian Empire was they had a pantheon of gods. They had a golden corral buffet of gods, if you will. And so this guy coming in saying that there's a God who's coming, who's going to overthrow your city, this was important, but I want us to see it wasn't specific to the whole city getting saved. It was God's grace that he delayed what would eventually come to them. A fast is proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Which begs this question. How does an entire city opposed to the Jewish God believe in the Jewish God, if even for a moment? Well, Daniel C. Timmer has some really good analysis here, and this is what he said. He said that the state of affairs would have made both rulers and subjects in the city of Nineveh unusually attuned to the message of a visiting prophet, meaning that there were circumstances and situations in this historic moment that made the people of Nineveh more aware and more attuned to the idea that maybe judgment was coming and that they ought to change the way that they were thinking. Around this time, history tells us that there was a massive solar eclipse that had occurred very near to this moment in time. And in the ancient Near East, there wasn't a category for this that was scientific. They saw it as a bad omen, that this was a sign of the gods. At the same time as this was going on, a plague had swept through the Assyrian Empire and actually negatively impacted the population of Nineveh in a significant way. On top of all of that going on, the city of Nineveh was on the edge of the Tigris River. And the ancient cuneiform that kind of describes the city of Nineveh, like their crest, was a house with a fish in it. And two of the gods that they worshipped, particularly in that city, because they were so attuned to the water and to the aquatic realities, were the god Dagon, who was literally a merman, all right? And Nanshi, who was a goddess of social justice, who was also of the sea. So you've got literally them worshiping Aquaman and Ariel from Little Mermaid, all right? So they're attuned to kind of what's going on here with all of these circumstances. So here comes a guy who spent 3 days washed in the gastric juices, right, of a fish. Like, this is part of his story. Walking down Main Street, right, bleached, all acid washed, right, like got like blonde tips, looking like a 1990s boy band guy, right, saying at the top of his lungs, hey, like, I just got swallowed by a fish, like, something's coming. This is important for us to understand because it gives us a principle about the heart and the character and the nature of God. Maybe something that you could resonate with in your own life. It's this. It's that God is doing more than what we can see on the surface. That God, in his great wisdom, understood that this solar eclipse and this plague and this particular culture's affinity towards the ocean and the way that they thought about fish, that all of these things would play into their willingness to accept a prophet that otherwise would not have been accepted in that particular setting or time. And I think this is really important for me and for you to remember today. Because there's our perspective on life and then there's God's perspective on life. And that God is doing immeasurably more than we could ever see or think, and in many ways imagine, at every particular moment. That when we've given up hope, God hasn't given up hope. When we've thrown in the towel, God is still at work. And that our perspective on what God is doing, it is limited, friend. This week I got to fly to London, took a red eye on Sunday night, flying into London to celebrate my mom and surprise her for her birthday. It was a really great moment. I shocked her and thought she might have had a heart attack, which had been really bad. But she made it through. She made it through. And as we were flying in to London, I kind of had this thought. As you know, the morning kind of, the sun has risen. You know, it's no longer dark, and we're kind of becoming to descend in to London. And the surrounding area, it's amazing when you're in a plane, right? You can look out, and it's like you can see for miles, right, on a crystal clear day. Now, when I'm in the city of London, sitting on a street, all I see are these big buildings around me, right? I want you to get this. You and I have a street-level view of life. God always has the 35,000-foot view. He's always seeing more than what we can see, and he's always doing more than what we can do. So I want to ask you this question today. Where have you given up where God has not? Where have you allowed your street-level view to limit your trust that God has a bigger view? This is the importance of moving from resentful obedience to redemptive trust. Because resentful obedience does it because it's all I can see, so I've just got to do it. Redemptive trust realizes, no, there's somebody who's got a bigger view, a better vantage point, who's working all things together for his glory and for my good. So I can trust him even when I don't understand where this is going. The story continues. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. So it's from the king all the way down. He said, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. But let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. There's a really, really powerful, kind of nuanced point here that I want to make that I think is so important for us. As we think about what the people of Nineveh were experiencing and how God relates to you and I, it's this. It's that God wants both our prayers and our actions. I find it so interesting that the king of Nineveh, right, the most powerful man in one of the greatest cities in the world during that time, he makes a decree saying every single person in the city, including all of our animals, we're all going to fast. We're all going to mourn. We're all going to acknowledge that the reason why we're in this situation is because of choices we have made on our own. And he tells them to do two particular things: to call urgently to God, that's prayer, but then also to give up, meaning to release, to stop doing their evil ways and their violent acts. And I think in this time and in this moment, it's really important for us to remember that what God is looking for in his people, particularly those who say, I'm a follower of Jesus, is God is looking for a faith that is not just only intellectual, but that is actually demonstratable as well. That our doing and believing, those two things are the same. That faith is not intellectual assent. Faith is trust and action. I have faith in this chair by sitting on it. That's how you know I actually have real faith. Jesus' little brother, who did not believe him to be the resurrected king until after he saw him resurrected, didn't believe that he was a savior until he could see his brother dead and then alive, who would go on to become one of the leaders in the church of Israel and suffer a terrible death because he believed that his brother had resurrected, pens these words in his letter to the churches in James in the New Testament. And he says this in the first century, reflecting on faith and spirituality. He says, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? And to be honest, some of you have walked away from faith because people say they have faith, but haven't showed it with their actions. You are dealing with the woundedness of people that have only lived with giving words, but not living it out indeed. He said, can that kind of faith save anyone? And then he gives us an example. He says, suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing. So he says, imagine you're walking down the street and there's a person who's in desperate need. Imagine you become aware of a population of people that are in significant need around the world, or imagine that there's a real sense of injustice that's occurring in your community. Imagine that that's happening and you're aware of it. And you say, goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. He said, what good does that do? You know, it's interesting in our culture nowadays. Does it just feel like there's something terrible happening every single day, right? Between the 24/7 news cycle and between Facebook, right? It's like I just want to pretend like none of that exists. And maybe you've seen this on Facebook, you've seen this in social media, or you've seen it on Twitter, or maybe you've even said it yourself. This phrase like, our thoughts and prayers are with, right? You guys seen that? Well, one of the big movements right now from people that are, that don't have faith or struggle with faith is, hey, your thoughts and prayers don't change anything. And I want you to hear me. They're not wrong, and they're not right. Because our thoughts and prayers matter. Because prayer works. Prayer moves. Prayer has impact. But thoughts and prayers are best given with action and engagements. So for some of us, we've stopped short of what God has actually invited us to do. So we have thoughts and prayers for orphans, but we aren't actively engaged in making life better for them. We have thoughts and prayers for those that are displaced around the world. More people displaced today than any time in human history, but we are not actively engaged in any way of making a difference. We have thoughts and prayers for those that are experiencing the negative impacts of injustice in our world, but we do nothing to stop it. And I want you to look here and understand something. Thoughts and prayers matter, but thoughts and prayers mean far more with action and engagement. And that's actually the invitation to every follower of Jesus. So a question we ought to be asking all of the time, and it changes from season to season, is this, is how will I put my faith in action this season? How will I take what I say I believe and make sure that it's not just out of my mouth, but my hands and feet are reflecting that? By the way, that's why we do things like Summer Serve Day on July 7th. That's why we curate experiences and environments for you to actually put your faith into action. Because church isn't simply a place you come on a Sunday. It's a people who go make a difference in their community. That's what real faith lived out looks like. For you, it might look like saying, we are going to sign up and we are going to be a part of that. For others, it might be saying, I'm going to put my faith in action in my workplace, and I'm going to find really creative ways to bring added value to my friends so that I can share with them the impact of Jesus. For others of us, it might look like, I'm going to start that thing that's been in my heart to do in my neighborhood because I want to bring people together. Because when we bring people together and work for the common good, we have an opportunity to show them that Jesus is not just something that we pay lip service to, but someone that we follow in day-to-day life. And I pray that this bothers you that I've said it. That something inside of you wrestles and stirs with the fact that your words are empty if they're not followed with action. The king says, who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. So when God saw what they did and how they turned, meaning literally repent, the idea that they were going one way, they were doing it their way, and they said, okay, we're gonna do it God's way. He relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. Here's the third principle today. God responds with favor to our humility. How humbling must it have been for the king of one of the greatest cities in one of the greatest empires to bow his knee to a foreign god, a god his people had gone into and destroyed their cities and their villages. But in that moment, he makes a decision to say, I'm going to bend my knee to a different way. I'm going to acknowledge my need. James continues to write, and he says this, that God gives grace generously. Anybody grateful for that good news? That God isn't stingy with his grace? Like God isn't like with me and, how I am with my moon pies toward my kids. Like God is generous, He gives generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud. Listen to this. Let it just sink into your bones and your soul. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. That for some of us, the opposition we feel in our life, things aren't working out the way we want them to work out. Things aren't going the way we want them to go. Part of that might be God's kindness to you, saying, I'm opposing your pride because you need humility. And in humility, you're going to find what your heart really needs. But here's the thing about humility, is that humility is a decision. It is not a disposition. Like if you're sitting here thinking, I think I'm pretty humble. You're not humble. Like that's the way it works. C.S. Lewis writes in his book, Joyful Christian, just this beautiful word. He said, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And, I love this, a biggish step too. At least nothing, whatever can be done before it. If you think you are not conceited, it means that you are very conceited indeed. That humility is this acknowledgement that you're prideful. That's step one. And pride is simply this. Pride is thinking that my way is better than God's way, or even kind of to a lesser degree, my way is equal to God's way. That, I know God's got a way for relationships, but my way's not bad. Yeah, I know God's got a way about finances, but my way, it's working. My way's better than those people's way. I know God's got a way about kind of how I ought to relate to my kids and love my spouse and walk in uprightness and pursue, singleness in the season that I'm in. But my way it's just not as bad as their way. So surely God's okay with my way. And the reality is that is pride on display. And it's a day-to-day reality, isn't it? It's a moment-by-moment thing for me. Realizing that there are portions of my life that I think are okay, that are not in alignment with what God has said is what's best for me. And here's what's so good, and this is why I love the God that we serve, is that God's way is not put there to make life difficult for us. It's so that we could find great joy and satisfaction in him. That his way exists for our benefit. That forgiveness is for your benefit. That generosity is for your benefit. That service is for your benefit. That loving others and living outside of yourself is for your benefit. So here's the question I want to ask you today. Am I willing to admit that my pride is the barrier between me and God? That perhaps there are parts of your life that you feel like, man, I'm doing it the way that God has called me to do it. And as long as I keep on doing these, God, would you let me keep this one? Like, is it okay if I'm like 90% there, but God, can I keep these over here? And here's the good news about God, is that God loves you. And he'll let you keep the 10%. You'll just continually fail in those areas. You'll just continue to fall apart in those places. You'll continually bang your head against the brick wall of your own pride and stupidity. And storms will come. And we will have bottom of the barrel, belly of the fish moments of our own making. All the while, God is saying, if you would just surrender it and release it to me, there's a better way. And that's Jonah's story. Because here's the thing about Jonah. Imagine if you're Jonah and you walk into the city thinking that you're going to die. And then the entire city, 8 words in English, 5 words in Hebrew, bend their knee to your God. That would be a moment of rejoicing, right? That would be a moment of gratitude, right? That would be a miracle. But it wasn't for Jonah. We'll talk more about this next week, but just to give you a little bit of a hint, look what happens in chapter 4, verse 1. God relents. And for Jonah, this seemed very wrong. And he became angry. Did you know that God could be working a miracle in your life and the people around you? And because of your own pride, you will be angry instead of joyful. That God could be doing incredible things in your home and in your workplace and in your community, in your own life, and you'll miss the miracle because of your own pride. So here's the bottom line. Whether or not you're walking with Jesus or not walking with Jesus or somewhere in between, humility is the way to God's heart. Humility is the means by which you will experience the favor of God. And the good news for me and the good news for you, it's not about my perfection. It's not my ability to be good. It's not my ability to pull it off that makes me right before God. The good news of Jesus that is given to us every single moment of every day is this. It's not that the good are in and the bad are out. It's not up to how good you are and how many good things you can pull off. It's that the humble are in and the prideful are out. That all you need to be right before your Heavenly Father, the creator of the universe, is to acknowledge your need and to trust that He is the solution. That Jesus lived the life you could not live, died the death you deserved, and defeated death on your behalf. And that He's worthy of your trust because He's always been faithful and He always will be. And He's a God you can trust because He's not like us. Because I can understand why Jonah was angry at the Ninevites. I could understand why Jonah wanted to see justice rain down on Assyria. He had seen his friends and his family lose their lives to the horrendous decisions of these people. But where Jonah wanted Nineveh to receive all of God's justice, Jesus received all of God's justice to us on the cross. That all of God's anger was placed on Jesus. That all of God's punishment was placed on Jesus. And that when Jesus hung on that cross and declared, "It is finished," it meant it was finished for all of us for all of time if we simply acknowledge our need. That it's never been about how good you are. It's always been about how good Jesus has been in your place. It's not about how much you can get right. It's about humility. Because God opposes the proud, but friend, He gives grace, unconditional love, unmerited favor to the humble. And that is the key that unlocks not only your salvation, but your joy today as well.